Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we're going to present part one of a story featuring a Syrian or Aramaean high-ranking military officer, a little Israelite girl who had been abducted by the Syrian army, and one of the Old Testament's most famous prophets, Elisha. This story is narrated in 2 Kings chapter 5. The episode begins by introducing Naaman, the military officer, and lavishing him with praise. He was a great man, well regarded by his master, obviously the Syrian king, and he was accorded superlative accolades since he had led Syrian armies to victory. As incredible as it is to see such lofty claims made about a military officer who was an enemy of Israel, even more unbelievable is the statement that Naaman's victories had been aided by the Lord, Israel's own God. That's in verse 1 of chapter 5. Why is the Israelite deity aiding and abetting one of Israel's mortal enemies? We'll have to address that disturbing question at a later point. In any case, the description continues by noting that this military figure was a mighty man of valor. Indeed, he had everything going for him, with one exception. He suffered from a serious skin disease. Though translations consistently render this Hebrew term with the word leprosy, we cannot be certain that this was technically the disease Naaman had. Let's just stick with the fact that he had a serious skin condition of some sort. Then the story introduces another character who seemingly played a minor role in the drama, an Israelite lass. She was serving as a maid in the Naaman household, specifically by being subservient to Naaman's wife. That's in verse 2. How was it that an Israelite girl was living with a Syrian family? It turns out that on one of the Syrian raids into Israelite territory, she was snatched up and carried off in slavery to Syria. Apparently, she had resigned herself to this terrible fate, for when she noticed the problems that Naaman had with his skin affliction, instead of secretly thanking God that this man was being punished, she instead offered help. Though she herself did not know how to alleviate Naaman's physical ailment, she knew of someone who did. So she blurted out to Naaman's wife, "Would that my Lord," referring to Naaman, of course, "were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he could be cured of his skin condition." That's in verse 3. As soon as Naaman became aware of what this Israelite slave had said, he informed the Syrian king of what she had said. That's in verse 4. The king immediately arranged for Naaman to take a trip to Israel by writing a diplomatic letter to the Israelite king. This was not an ordinary Syrian taking a little jaunt into Israel to see a medical specialist. This was a diplomatic matter. Keep in mind Naaman's status in Syria's military and political affairs. What is most interesting about this, though, is that the Israelite girl had said nothing about the Israelite king. She had only mentioned a prophet who lived in Samaria. But apparently kings do not deal with prophets. They deal with other kings. The Syrian king wanted to communicate with his Israelite counterpart. He did not say a word about any prophet. Indicating the gravity of this diplomatic mission, when Naaman went to Israel, he did not go empty-handed. he brought along a fine present consisting of 10 talents of silver, 6,000 gold coins, and 10 festal garments. That's in verse 5. And an expensive gift like this would indicate not only the status of the person bringing it, but the confidence that he would get what he wanted, in this case, being healed of his grievous skin condition. Since the Syrian king had written a diplomatic letter to the Israelite king, naturally, when Naaman arrived in Israel, he went straight to the Israelite monarch for an audience. The military man read the letter to the king at once. The letter was crisp and to the point. Quote, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his skin disease." That's in verse 6. This is astounding. The little Israelite girl had talked about a prophet who may have helped. A king was not even on her radar. The Syrian king's sending a letter to his Israelite counterpart is quite revealing. He had equated political power with healing power. It never occurred to him that a king would ever be deficient in any way. The demand was clear. The Israelite king was to make sure that Naaman was cured. When the Israelite king read the letter, he could not believe what he was being asked to do. He had no such power. It was absurd for anyone else to think he could do this, regardless of the fact that it was the Syrian king who ordered this. The Israelite king tore his garments to lament and protest this ridiculous demand. His verbal reaction was equally telling. Only God had power of this sort. Only God had the ability to give or take away life. Almost surely, the king supposed, this request was made as an act of political or possibly military intimidation. That's in verse 7. Before long, the word on the street was that the Israelite king had ripped off his clothes when he got this letter from the Syrian king. Attuned to the word on the street, Elisha got wind of what the Israelite monarch had done. He sent a message to the king, which included a question and a demand. The question was, "Why have you ripped off your clothes?" The question was a way of criticizing the king for indicating weakness. The demand was, "Send the man to me, so that he will know there is a prophet in Israel." Elisha was hardly being subtle. There was a source of power in Israel, but it had nothing to do with politics. That's in verse 8. Since the Israelite king was powerless, Naaman went to Elisha's house. Of course, he went with full military regalia and an entourage of horses and chariots. That's in verse 9. This must have been quite a scene. Naaman is at the door, accompanied by this parade of soldiers with all the pomp and circumstance they could express. Perhaps Naaman was hoping to make the morning papers or have CNN cover the event. Elisha was completely unimpressed with this display. He did not even go to the door himself to greet this famous military officer. Instead, he sent a messenger. This messenger offered no greeting whatsoever. He simply told Naaman that he needed to go to the Jordan River and wash 7 times. If he does this, his skin condition will disappear. He'll be as good as new. That's in verse 10. Naaman saw this as an intentional snub. How dare a person of his stature and standing be treated so insolently? Naaman even voices what he thought the prophet would do when he arrived at his house. I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the one with the disease. That's in verse 11. Obviously, Naaman was expecting a spectacle, replete with gestures, formal prayers, and pompous announcements. He wanted to be the center of a public performance. The prophet insulted Naaman's dignity by not at least coming out of the house to greet him. Instead, he has sent a flunky asking me to go to the Jordan River and wash myself 7 times. No wonder Naaman is outraged. He even calls into question the Jordan River, bragging that Syria had Abba and Pharpar, rivers far superior to the Jordan. Why could he not have washed in these rivers? Naaman did not explain what makes one river better than another. Still, he is so angry that he is lashing out against Israelite topography. The Syrian military officer is not a happy camper, to say the least. He left Elisha's house in a rage. That's in verse 12. Evidently, he planned to go right back to Syria. But Naaman's servants intuited this and suggested that he rethink his position. They asked whether he would have complied with the messenger's instruction had he requested that Naaman do some great thing. That's in verse 13. Clearly, Naaman's servants knew their boss well, for doing some great thing was what the officer had in mind all along. Since all the messenger said was required was to wash in the river, what was one to lose by doing that? Somehow, the argument worked. Naaman went straight to the Jordan River and dipped in 7 times. Just as the man of God had predicted, when Naaman did this, his skin was restored as though he were a boy. That's in verse 14. A little girl back in Syria started this whole episode. Now the great military officer could boast having a skin like that of a little boy. Naaman returned to Elisha, called for the second time a man of God, one of the ways a prophet is referred to in Israel. That's in verse 15. Once again he came with, quote-unquote, all his company. But this time Naaman had no interest to put on a show of strength. Instead, he stood before him, that is, Elisha, in verse 15. That was a posture of acknowledgement and humility. After the Jordan experience, Naaman knew that there was a prophet in Israel, just as the little girl had said. It was a mistake for him and the Syrian king to think that the Israelite king was the mover and shaker in these matters. Prophets had access to power that not even kings could imagine. Naaman now knew that. However, in addition to Naaman's skin being restored, he also underwent a conversion of sorts. He confessed that because of what had happened, he now realized that the Israelite deity was the only one that existed. Of course, this was a thinly veiled criticism of all the Syrian gods, to whom Naaman had surely prayed for healing, but to no avail. Naaman had not only a change of skin, but a change of heart. Because of this radical transformation, he now wanted to express his gratitude with a present. Recall the very expensive present he had brought with him when he first made the trip. That's back in verse 5. He now wanted to use that gift as a thank offering. So he asked Elisha to accept what he had brought. But the prophet refused to accept the present. That's in verse 16. Naaman insisted. Elisha did not budge. What would have been wrong with accepting this gift? The money could have been used to support prophetic ministry. The prophets under Elisha's care had to eat, had to be housed, had to take care of their families. Perhaps some sort of education was involved. The money could have been used for very good, even noble purposes. Still, Elisha was steadfast. Evidently, he did not want even a suggestion that a prophet could be bought, as it were. Naaman's new belief in Israel's God would be sufficient, thank you. No money needs to change hands. After Naaman was rebuffed in his effort to give a gift for his miraculous healing, he was not done. If he could not give a present, he would ask for one. This is some turnaround. Instead of giving, Naaman wanted to take something. What did he have in mind? In light of the expensive gift he had brought to Israel, what possibly might he request? The Syrians were flush. Was this an attempt to shake down the prophet? Did Naaman realize that he had an easy mark on his hands? Had he already rescinded his conversion? Those questions are answered when we realize what Naaman wanted for this present. All he asked for is Israelite dirt, enough that could be carried by 2 mules. Israelite dirt! If the Jordan River pales in comparison to 2 Syrian rivers, what might make Israelite dirt so valuable? This is the strangest of requests. We will have to wait for part 2 of this story to explain the reason for Naaman's odd desire to bring back to Syria with him 2 mule loads of good, old-fashioned Israelite dirt. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know your email so that I can contact you when we're ready to advertise for our mini courses. I'm in the process of learning how to do that. I'm a slow learner, so give me a little time. I know you've been doing that. And also, if you have questions that you would like me to address in a future question and answer session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.